Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are kicking off Zionism After Dark masterclass series for our parents, for existing parents, and for prospective parents. And the reason we wanted to do this is to show our biggest supporters, our parent community, what kind of education our teens receive, what kind of discussions we're having, and what kind of caliber of speakers come to Club Z. I am very happy that, I would have never dreamt that Club Z would grow so much. So I want to just share with you just a couple of pictures from last year. So this was the COVID year. I think we're the only teen organization that continued to have programming in person. So just a couple of slides. This was our opening retreat in New York. This is us in Charlotte. We really are growing. And the goal of this call and the goal of further calls would be to help us recruit. So if your team is already in the program, great. Please tell your friends. As wonderful as we are, we want to be even more wonderful in even more places, so we can get more kids to come to us. Okay, so without further ado, we chose the three topics, the three sessions that we're going to have. We're going to kick it off with attorney and an author and a commentator, Ran Bar-Yoshfat, and he's going to talk about Israel's legal rights and international law. Our next Monday, we're going to have Olga Meshwa-Washington. She's going to address our biggest complaints that you hear, biggest anti-Israel complaints, I guess, that you hear against Israel. And I'm gonna finish up in 2 weeks with practical Zionism, meaning what do you do now with everything that you know? How do you address it in your life, in your kids' life, and in general? So I do ask that everybody please get on camera. We want to see you. We want to make sure that we can read the room. And you're welcome to chat your questions in the chat. And then I will call on you to either ask it or I'll just ask for you. And let's begin. Mr. Ran Bar-Yoshfat.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Masha. Allow me to first just share the screen here. Okay, can you all see it? Yeah, okay, awesome. So very happy to be here. I'll tell you in a sentence a little bit about myself. My day job, because it's not daytime in Israel right now, my day job is I'm the deputy director of the Kohelet Policy Forum, which is a very big think tank in Israel. I'm an attorney. I got my law degree from Hebrew University. I have a master's in business from the Tel Aviv University, and I'm currently working on my PhD in history from the Haifa University. I conduct research in the fields of comparative constitutional law and international law. I wrote a policy paper about the United Nations. My second policy paper is going to be published, I hope, in the next month or so. And I've published 2 books. And my third book, which will be in English, which is called I'm Zionist, will be published hopefully in the next couple of months. So that's a little bit about who I am. And today I'm going to talk to you about international law and Israel's legal rights. The way I want to tackle this topic is to understand, if we're talking about international law and Israel's legal rights, I think we have to first of all understand what is the point of law, and then what is international law. And then we need to talk about how countries are created, and then to see the case of Israel, if it's the same, if it's a little bit different, and so on and so forth. So for those of you who are attorneys, I apologize. This is going to be very simplistic, but I only have 30 minutes, so I'm going to try to do my best in this time frame. So let's begin. When we're talking about law, why do we have law? The purpose of law basically is to do two things. Number one is to solve conflicts. If Masha and I have a dispute, then instead of having Masha taking an axe and me taking a baseball bat and go at each other, we go to a court of law and we solve our disputes there. So that's the main goal of the purpose of law. And the second purpose of law is to explain to people how they're supposed to conduct, right? It's the written norm, in a sense. Now, law, you have many different types of law. You have tax law, you have corporate law, you have torts law, you have many different types of law. The biggest difference is civic law and criminal law. What do I mean by that? There's one thing that if I, for instance, by accident, if I destroyed Ron's car, then Ron can sue me in a civil court, and he can get me, he can basically ask me to pay him for the damage that I've caused him. But if I've done damage to his car on purpose, and I also not only damaged him, but I also did something that's against the law. So basically, law is divided between the different citizens and also between the state and the citizen, which means that the government has the ability to punish me. The government can punish me with a fine, or the government can punish me by even sending me to jail. So that's something that's very, very unique when it comes to law. Basically, it says that the government has power. So that's, law 101 in a sentence. So when we're international law, we need to understand what is it that we mean there. Because I can understand that when we're talking about the law inside a country or state, then you have the police and you have the court of that state. So when we're saying international law, what is it that we mean? Who is the, I can say, okay, so countries versus countries is like citizens versus citizens, but who is the world police? Who is the world's Supreme Court? And then we need to talk about how countries are created. Are countries created by different big non-state actors? Are countries created because they declare themselves? Are countries created because of the use of force? And if Israel is a unique case, or if Israel is a case just like any other case in the world.
Analysis. So,
let's just, if people are able to put themselves on mute, perfect. Thank you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about international law, because I mentioned law in a sentence, but I mentioned law. So when we're talking about international law, some people think that the world police is the United Nations. The United Nations does not create states. The only thing the UN can do is it can accept states as members. Before the UN was created in 1945, there were states, there were countries. If the United States will cease to exist, which I have to say, I'm not sure that's a horrible thing, the states will still continue to exist, and they can still cooperate with each other, and they will still have international law. So the UN, unlike what a lot of people think, it's actually not the world police, it's just another state actor. International law, unlike regular law, is based on 5 criteria. The number one is agreements or treaties. The second is customs. The third is legal principles. The fourth is verdicts and scholars. And the fifth is universal justice. So there's a big difference in the academia. I don't think there's a dispute about this. There's a big difference between the first 2 criteria of international law and the last 3. The first 2 are the most significant. When we think about international law, sometimes we think about high politics, meaning war or peace or stuff like that. But actually, most of international law is low politics, which is agreement on airspace, environment, and trade, and so on and so forth. If one country tells another country, I will sell you oranges and you will sell me apples, that's international law. It's a treaty between 2 countries. These treaties can be bilateral, meaning between 2 countries, or multilateral, which means it's between many countries. So here's the question: if there is no world police, and if there is no entity that basically like the government is for the citizens, so is international law even a real legal system? And there is a debate in the academia, but the main opinion basically is yes, we're talking about set of rules. There is an international community. What is the international community? Well, basically, most countries want to be accepted and want to be a team player. In the international community, you have states, you have non-state actors, you have non-governmental organizations, and you have the United Nations, and they're working to promote their interests. So it's also human rights, which is what people usually think of when we're talking about international law, but it's actually a lot of commerce. So basically, yes, I would say that the international law is a legal system, and most people view it as such. But it's also a little bit different than the regular legal system. Why do I say that? Because even if I'll think of the UN Charter as the international law constitution, we have to remember that not everyone is so obligated. For instance, the superpowers, China, Russia, and the USA, are not always so obligated to the different agreements. Why? Because, well, basically they are very, very strong. So they don't have to always obey everything that basically they signed upon, or they can say we're not signing certain agreements. So I'm going back here for a second. So we talked about law, and we talked about international law. What is international law compared to regular law? And then we need to think of, okay, so how are countries created? So the concept of international law is fairly new. It's a little bit over 100 years ago, if I think of the League of Nations. But countries were there long before that. And even if I'll take the most modern approach, that countries were only created since the 1848, the rise of nation states in Europe, still that's long before we're talking about the international law that we know today. So what we're talking basically now is the two different approaches of how countries are created legally. The two main approaches is declarative or constitutive. Constitutive, I think I'm saying it properly. There is a convention that's called the Montevideo Convention. And basically that convention says that if you want to be a state, if you want to be a country, basically you have to pass certain criteria. The four criteria are that you have a permanent population, that you have a defined territory, that you have a government, and that you have the capacity to enter into relations with other states. All right, everyone's on mute. Thank you. And there's a debate if that's enough, meaning if you have people, territory, government, and capacity to work with other states, does that make you a state? There is an approach that says you just need to declare yourself as a state. And if you're strong, if you have an army, if you have enough money to pay other people to fight you, that doesn't matter. If you're fighting yourself, or if you're paying someone else to fight for you, if you have enough power, then just declare yourself as a state, and that's it. The other approach says that that's not how it works. You need to have other countries recognize you. And if other countries recognize you, then you can say that you are a state. So these are the two approaches. Again, notice that this is a convention that's from 1933. There were countries before that, but that's just something that people agreed upon. So the question is, now that we know what law is and what international law is, and how countries in general are created, the two different approaches, either they just declare themselves as a states according to the four criteria, or they don't only need to declare themselves, but they also need to have other countries accept them, then we can talk about Israel, right? That's the framework in general for the world. So the legal framework, the international legal framework, and the history of the creation of countries, and then how it was implemented in different conventions. So now we need to talk about Israel. So if we're thinking of Israel as only declarative, so basically we don't need anything else apart from the four criteria. So if Israel has a territory, which it does, it has a government, which it does, it has population, and it has capacity to have relations with other countries. So that's it. It's a state. It has a legal right. But just to be on the safe side, we want to make sure that Israel does play well with others. So let's see how we can prove that Israel plays well with others. So for that, we need to go a little bit back in history and say, okay, let's see what are the recognitions, the basically approval of the world for the establishment of the State of Israel. So first and foremost, we have the Balfour Declaration from 1917. Basically, Lord Balfour, by the way, just as an anecdote, right now I'm speaking to you from a house in Israel in a place called Balfouria, which is named after Lord Balfour. And I'm literally speaking to you from the house that Lord Balfour visited when he was in Israel. The house is renovated, but it's that house. That's just an anecdote. So the Balfour Declaration basically stated that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So let's see where we are in history. We're talking about just at the end of World War I, and basically that's before we have states in these areas. We have empires. We have the Ottoman Empire. So after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, basically there's a lot of territory and it needs to be divided. And the Brits, who are now in control of that area, they're saying we're going to establish a national home for the Jewish people. 3 years later, we have the San Remo Resolution, 1920. So after the First World War, they ratified the Balfour Declaration, making it legally binding under international law. Meaning, if you remember international law, we have a discussion, is it a legal system or is it not a legal system? We say that most countries follow most of the laws most of the time. So basically that gives the Balfour Declaration a legal binding. It means that the world recognizes the right of the Jews to have sovereignty in their homeland. I'm going to stop you for 1 second, just go back to this declarative and constitutive. Yeah. So declarative, easy. Constitutive, also happening, because again, we see that the world recognizes Israel's right to exist legally. 2 years later, the League of Nations approved the British mandate in Palestine, which is at that time Israel plus what is today's Jordan, for the reconstituting the Jewish people's national home. That was the point of the British mandate. People sometimes forget it. The reason why we had the British mandate over this area where I'm staying right now, the land of Israel, is to make sure that the Jews are able to establish their home. Unfortunately, the British people, I would say, failed to do so as they were supposed to in the beginning. So this is the beginning of the legal claims, the international legal claims for Israel's legitimacy. To follow that, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Anglo-American Convention from 1924. Basically, there was a convention between America and the UK, and they stated again that they are recognizing the right of the Jewish people to settle in all parts of the land of Israel. This is actually very interesting. It means that unless there's a very big shift in the American policy, this is a treaty that America signed on. So if they want to change it, they actually need to change a treaty. It needs to be passed in Congress. Following that, the League of Nations, as you know, collapsed because the point of the League of Nations was to make sure that there's stability in the world. But after World War I, we had World War II. The League of Nations had no teeth. It had no power. Basically, it was different countries coming together, but they didn't have the actual power to do something. That's one of the reasons why the UN was created. By the way, the biggest difference between the League of Nations and the United Nations is America. Like if I had to pinpoint what is the difference between the League of Nations and the United Nations, it's America. Even though Woodrow Wilson was one of the, I would say, inventors of the League of Nations, America was a bystander. Even though America did fight in the end of World War I in some parts, but it wasn't as involved as it is right now in the world. And right now, the UN, what is different, the main difference between the UN and the League of Nations is Chapter 7 to the UN, which means that you also have the ability to actually use force, the ability to have sanctions over countries, the ability to maneuver different military personnel from one country to the other. So that is the biggest difference. So now in 1945, when we have the United Nations, Article 80 of the UN Charter, which is, as I mentioned before, somewhat of a international law constitution, says that the right of the Jewish people to settle in all parts of the land of Israel remains. The one thing that makes life more tricky is the partition plan from November 29th, 1947. This is a non-binding resolution. The General Assembly basically wanted to take the 30% that was left to the Jews, because the Balfour Declaration talked about Israel and what is today's Jordan. Then the Brits gave 70% to the Hashemite kingdom, left Israel with 30% of that, and that was supposed to be divided into half. And the General Assembly of the UN, which is a non-binding resolution, said we're going to have the partition plan. The Arabs rejected the offer. The Jews accepted the offer. There's also a very big question, why would the Jews accept only 15% of what was promised to them? And the main answer is, if we'll go back, Israel didn't only want to have a declarative legal rights, they also wanted to say, we play well with others. So while the United Nations was, today it has about 200 countries, close to 200 countries, when it began, when it was established, it had about 51. When Israel joined the UN, it had less than 60. So Israel said, I want to be a team player. So if I have a lot of countries that are willing to recognize me, I will take whatever offer I will accept. So basically, before I wrap it up and open it to Q&A, I'm just going to summarize it. Law is supposed to settle disputes and show you how to behave. Regular law in a country, you have law between people, civic law, and you have law between the government and the people. The government can use force against its people. You have the police, you can go to trial and you can pay a fine or go to jail. When we're talking about international law, we do not have a world police. We do not have the Supreme Court of the world. We have the ICC, the International Criminal Court. We have the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, but these are not compulsory. You only are under these courts if you prove them, if you're willing to be under their jurisdiction. We can have a whole session about that. But most countries, most of the time, follow most of the laws because they want to be part of the world's international community, which is countries, non-state actors, NGOs, the UN, and so on and so forth. How are countries created? Well, first of all, they can declare themselves if they have the 4 criteria: population, territory, government, and connections to other countries. But also, if you just want to be on the safe side, you also have to see that other countries recognize your right to exist. So when we're talking about Israel, we're saying, if we're talking about agreements and customs, we're saying that, well, from 1917, the Balfour Declaration saying that this is going to be a national home for the Jewish people, then the San Remo resolution making it legally binding under international law, the League of Nations adopting this resolution, reconstituting the Jewish people's national home, then the Anglo-American Convention saying that they recognize the rights of the Jewish people to settle in all parts of the land of Israel, then Article 80 of the UN Charter, and then finally the partition plan, which again had a majority countries saying we are accepting Israel, we recognize Israel as a country. You cannot unrecognize a country. That is not something you can do. You cannot say, we're no longer willing to play with you. Once you've recognized the country, that's it. There are, by the way, countries in the world, states, that are not part of the UN, like Somaliland. And you also have members of the UN that are not countries, like the Holy See. But once you were recognized as a country, and you're accepted in the world, basically that is considered to be legally. Your legal card is a part of the international community. I'm going to stop here, open it for Q&A. Thank you very much. I think I was in time, even 2 minutes faster, I think.
Yes, you were. Very cool. Thank you. Okay, while people are getting their creative juices and questions going, I do have a question for you, Ran. Okay, you just mentioned that there's a declarative and the other word.
Constitutive. I think that's how you're pronouncing it.
We got two foreigners, trying to speak English. And once the country is recognized, it cannot be taken back. What's going on with the Palestinian Authority? Because I thought that they were recognized, like they have an embassy in Washington, they have ambassadors all over the place, but yet they're still not recognized as a country.
Yeah, but that's a different story for them. I'll explain. Right now, if any Arab leader in Judea and Samaria will say that they declare themselves as a state, I am willing to put my money that they will murder them, because that also means that they're done setting the borders. So if there's going to be an Arab leader that says, we're creating another Arab state, an Arab state in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, they gave up on Israel. And that is not something that's acceptable. I think that's one of the main reasons why we don't have peace, because it's not really just about that territory. But you are correct. They are recognized as a non-state actor at the UN. No one recognized them as a state. They're recognized in the UN as a non-state actor. And again, you also have other non-state actors, like the Holy See, for instance. The Vatican is a non-state actor. That is actually one of the biggest arguments I have, that we don't have a partner for peace. Because in theory, they have all the criteria to create a state. If I look at the Montevideo Convention, so they have a territory, they have a people, they have a government too, actually, and they have more relations with other countries basically than Israel. So all they have to do, if they want to be a state, they just have to say, we now declare ourselves, like Ben Gurion did in 1948. In 1948, Ben Gurion said, we now declare that Israel is a state. That's all they're lacking, basically, to become a state. But I think that will also be the end of them, because I don't think that their main desire is just to create a state in Judea and Samaria.
Right. Olga, you want to ask the question? Oh, you're muted. You're muted. Hold on.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Ron. It's good to see you again. I actually typed my question in just as Marsha started to speak. So I guess if I were to ask it differently to what I put in the chat, the requirements to recognize statehood in the UN, is that different to the ICC? Because the ICC has recognized Palestine as a state, which is now they're going after them with regards to jurisdiction.
Okay, so that's a little bit more tricky. Let's see if I can put this. The ICC is an organ of the UN. It's one of the UN's organs. I would say one of the most problematic organs of the UN. You can find in some UN websites, you can find them writing State of Palestine. But the question is, how does the General Assembly sees them? How does the Security Council sees them? And the answer to that is that they're a non-state actor. If you go to the official UN website, they will definitely state it's a non-state actor. You can be considered to be a state for something. For instance, if you want to apply, I don't know, if you want to go to the World Trade Organization and try to raise an argument. The issue with the PA is that if they are considered a state for the ICC, that's also very, very bad for them, because that means that they have responsibility for their actions, which right now they don't really. Meaning acts of terror, meaning the glorification of terrorists, the pay for slay. So if they are considered to be a state, that actually puts them at risk. what they're doing, and I think they're doing very smart, is that they're actually walking in a very, very thin line, and they've been doing so since the mid 2000s, the 2009 or so. And that is that they're saying we're trying to see what we can do as a non-state actor, the closest that we can be to a state, but not a complete full state recognition. So I don't know if did I answer your question? I see that you also wrote the borders are dispute. So for the Montevideo Convention, there is a dispute in the academia. Do you have to have all 4 criteria? For instance, you can also argue that Israel's borders are not defined. But I'm not sure that, that's the problem here, because you don't have to have completely defined territory. You have to have somewhat of a defined territory. So if the Golan Heights and Judean Samaria and Gaza, if it's all disputable, okay, but Israel proper is there. So you do have some sort of a territory. And I think that that's also true for the Arabs living in Judean Samaria and Gaza. I don't think that that's why they would be disqualified as a state. I think that the main reason why they are disqualified as a state is because they are not declaring themselves as a state. That, in my opinion, that's the biggest reason why they're not, because they in theory, they can right now, they can at this hour, 4 a.m. in Israel, they can say, we now declare ourselves a state. And I think a lot of countries in the world will accept it. And I think that there's a very good reason why they don't do this. Again, as I mentioned, one is because I don't think that the Arab public will accept it, because basically it means that they've given up on Israel proper. And second of all, it also means that if they are a state, then they can no longer say that, oh, this was a random act of terror, because then you have responsibilities as a state. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right, I wanna, there's a question regarding sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. Isn't it Israel's right to extend sovereignty based on the fact that they captured the land from Jordan, who had illegally occupied it in 1948, and that there was never a Palestinian government?
No, actually, I personally strongly believe that Israel has a right over Judea and Samaria, but not because of that. Under international law, even if you were in a defensive war, the fact that you've gained land doesn't make you the owner of that land. However, because the latter part of the question is more accurate, because Jordan illegally occupied that territory, and there is a rule. Let me see if I can share another presentation here. 1 second. Stop this here. Share with you something else. Okay, this is the reason why one of the reasons why it belongs to Israel, because of the rule of the uti possidetis juris, which basically means that throughout the world, if you want to know what is the territory of a certain land, the rule is that you inherit the land of the previous sovereign power that was there before. So if I will take the Ukraine, for example, or the Crimea, you can say that in the Ukraine, some people are actually Russians, but the Crimea is Ukrainian. Why? Because of after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, that's how the borders were, and that's it, and that's how you live it. So when the Brits left the land of Israel, these were the borders, and you cannot say, well, because Jordan illegally occupied part of it, then it belongs to Jordan. So that's one of the main reasons why basically all of Judea and Samaria. Again, this rule applies to everywhere in the world apart from Israel, apparently. But legally, that's how it works. That you're supposed to inherit the area that you received from the entity that was there before you. That's one of the reasons, at least, why Judea and Samaria belongs to Israel. There are obviously other reasons. The fact that people call it in English, I call Judea and Samaria. In English, people call it the West Bank. It's only west of Jordan. For instance, for me, it's east of me. Israel has a peace treaty with Jordan. So even if Jordan's occupation was legal, which it was not, when Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty, Jordan gave up all of their rights over Judea and Samaria. And finally, historically, there was never a state called Palestine. So you cannot really occupy it from a non-existing entity. You can say for peace reasons, for your interest, if people are willing to create another entity, that's one thing. But historically, there was never a state called Palestine there. You cannot occupy it from a non-existing entity. For all of these reasons and some more, that's why I would argue that Judea and Samaria legally, actually legally, I would say Judea and Samaria is easier to explain than the Golan Heights.
Ran, I push back.
Please.
There's an echo. Is there an echo?
No echo.
No echo. Okay. I want to push back or add to answer. I don't know. I'm not the legal expert here. However, the borders and the territory that are still legally binding are rooted in the San Remo Conference and then were made into law by the Mandate of Palestine in 1922. So isn't that what gives us the right to be in that territory?
Yeah, it's the same thing basically. We're not disputing. It's the same thing. The territory basically also includes Jordan, but Israel is not claiming Jordan right now. But the fact is that throughout all of the things that I've shared with you, it does include Judea and Samaria. No one thought that it does not include Judea and Samaria, and because of that, the territory that Israel has left at the end includes also Judea and Samaria. So when the British left, okay, in the League of Nations, when they approved the British mandate in Palestine, it was for the reconsidering the Jewish people's national home. That was the job of the British mandate. So yes, it's the follow-up of the San Remo resolution, which is the follow-up of the Balfour Declaration. The San Remo is what made it legally binding. And the fact that another entity, in this case, Jordan, illegally occupied Judea and Samaria doesn't make it then. But we're not, it's the same thing. We're saying the same thing from a different angle. The argument that someone could say against you is the question that I was asked. Basically, they could say, let's say Jordan would claim that Israel attacked it during Israel's independence war. So does that mean that Jordan has the right over Judea and Samaria? The answer would be no, because under international law, you're not allowed to gain land even if you were attacked. Okay, that is a law under international law. The territory itself belonged to Israel, so it doesn't matter. But yes, it's because of the San Remo resolution. But the point is that even if someone else took that territory, legally it belongs to Israel because that was the shape of the British mandate, and that was the last force that was there before they left.
Okay. Yet another question from Dan. Dan, you're great. I've heard arguments online that the mandate for Palestine was intentionally ambiguous on if a Jewish national home would be all of the mandate or in part of the mandate. So what's your question, Dan?
I think, like, you know, if we're getting into a really legalese kind of discussion, which isn't often, but if you are, I've actually had people come back to me with that point, that they're like you're claiming, Dan, that Israel really is entitled to all of the mandate land based on the League of Nations, but it never specified the League of Nations where exactly that national home would be. So it was like always, it said in Palestine, right? So it was never like really clear. I think the argument about what you were saying, like the mandate authorities, the British authorities were the last ones to have the area to control those borders. So that's what gives Israel the better title to Judea Samaria, as opposed to resting your argument on the League of Nations.
Okay, I think that's a fairly fair argument. However, 1 second. You can see what I'm sharing right now, right? I hope so.
Yes, we see it.
Yep.
Okay, so I think it's a fair argument. However, we have to remember when we say Palestine, what do we mean? Because I'm sure that all of the audience here knows that it was a name given by the Romans after they kicked the Jews out of Judea and so on and so forth. But Palestine is also a name that was used by the Brits in this very weird half T-shirt shape of a territory that they've taken. You know, this is very common for colonialism. These straight lines. Okay, that's not really the line. The straight line of Jordan is because of the pipelines that are going there. That is a British concept. That is a British division of the land. So it's a fair argument. I just think it's a very weak argument because they're the ones who took this shape and named it Palestine. If you would go just a few years back, you would see the shape of that area under the Ottomans, and that would be a different shape. And if anything, for some parts of it, it's bigger, and for some parts of it is smaller. But in any regards, it's definitely all of what we have Israel today proper plus Judea and Samaria. That would be the minimum of the minimum of the minimum of what you would say Palestine is. So again, I think it's a good argument, but again, it would have to mean that the British people divided that territory between the Brits and the French. If you remember, the British were also in control of Iraq, which is a little bit more to the east there. They divided it. They coined that area Palestine, meaning there was a territory called Palestine with Greater Syria and so on and so forth. They reshaped it, called it Palestine, and then in their own legal document, when they wrote Palestine, they meant something else with the territory. It's an argument. I would say it's not a very strong argument, but let's give them that. Let's say that that's the case. Then they divided that Palestine into Palestine and Transjordan, which is today's Jordan. So even if I'll take that argument, again, the minimum of the minimum would be Israel proper plus the Gaza Strip plus Judea and Samaria, because that is what the British had envisioned before the partition plan. I hope I gave you an answer, but I think it's a stronger argument to say that the British people knew what they were saying and they were referring to the maps that they have basically drafted by themselves.
Thanks.
Nice.
I'm so happy I had a few more slides open just in case you had questions in other directions. Yeah.
You're like the Boy Scout, always prepared.
Yeah.
Am I echoing?
Is there any other question?
All right, now we have 18 people who are ready to present Israel's case in international law. Ran, have you
Can
heard?
I say something, Masha?
Yeah,
just
yeah.
one thing before people are very scared of international law. International law is, I love international law, so maybe I'm not the best example, but international law is not that scary. Basically, if you remember you need to remember the two things of international law: treaties that can be either bilateral or multilateral, and customs. Basically, that's the two biggest things with international law. So it's not really that different when, if you've ever rented an apartment, then you can also understand international law, because when you rent an apartment, you have a treaty between you and the landlord. Okay, so treaties can be between two countries. I'll sell you oranges, you'll sell me apples. And it can be between several countries, like most countries in the world signed the UN Charter or accepted it in such a way. So sometimes people say, oh, international law, it's so scary. I love debating international law, because usually when people give me the international law part, I'm like, when you're saying Israel is violating something, like, please show me. Like, that's my field of expertise. It's not that much knowledge. You have to learn a little bit about the Geneva Convention and the Rome Convention. Not convention, the Rome, however you say it in English. But basically, that's about it. Like, it's not that complicated. And I would argue that legally, actually, most of the arguments are on our side. The plot thickens, though. The issue is that under criteria 3, 4, and 5 for what is international law, you also have basically the discourse. So if the ICC will say enough times that Israel is violating international law, that would become reality. Which is why I think it's very important to fight ICC's resolutions, which I would say are illegal, and we need to address it, but it will be eventually significant enough that you cannot ignore it. But right now, if we're talking about what is actually written in treaties, we're good. We have the upper hand.
Okay, so since you mentioned ICC, and it's International Criminal Court, correct? Is that what it stands for?
International Criminal Court, yes.
Correct. And right now, the ICC has trying to bring Israel into the court to answer for some human rights violations. And there's a whole movement within Israel and in a pro-Israel Zionist community to point the fact that ICC has no power. Can you speak, no jurisdiction? Can you speak on that just for a few minutes?
In theory, basically, if you want to be under any court, any international court, you need the agreements of both sides. Because again, unlike the government in a state, there is no world police. However, if Article 7 to the UN is being activated, basically, then the UN has power. There are also a few exceptions. One is the World Trade Organization, the other is the ICC. The ICC can say, because of severe human rights violation, we want to investigate. Opening parentheses for a second, apart from the fact that the person that wants to investigate Israel, she herself was, I guess I would say, cautiously involved in crimes against humanity in her own country, but I'm going to put that aside. The timing is very, very political, meaning they were waiting to see if they're going to investigate or not. The Trump administration basically told the ICC, you're not going to investigate the US or Israel or any of our allies when you're not investigating Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia. It seems very political and not really trying to help humanity, but basically use law as a political leverage. And lastly, the person who's doing the investigation is about to be changed soon. So it seems like someone is saying, I'm going to start an investigation, go away, and they're going to have to investigate. What are the implications of that? The implications is that very high-ranking officers, Israeli officers, if they ever go abroad, they might be charged with crimes against humanity. What is mostly common is that countries would say, we heard you, we're doing our own investigation. We don't need you to investigate the stuff that we're doing, and therefore you don't have any legal claims to what we're saying. I think that there's a problem. My criticism towards Israel is that Israel is very, the Israeli government is very scared to be on the offense, because I think it can be a very good opportunity for Israel to say, okay, you wanna take the issue to court. We have Hamas in Gaza. They're literally trying to, in their charter, they're saying murder Jews, not Israel. They're not saying murder Israelis. They're saying murder Jews. All right, let's take it to court. But honestly, I think that the best reaction for Israel, it's my opinion. It's not, I'm not the Attorney General for Israel, but my opinion is that Israel should not respond at all and just say, we're not playing with this, because this is completely political and not legal at all. It's just a political tool against Israel. I'm actually currently writing a paper about the ICC and what they're doing with Israel. And just so we'll be on the same page, because I think this is something that most people don't know. How does the ICC get its information? How do they know that Israel is doing such horrible things? So apparently you have about 5,000 NGOs. All of them are just focusing on vilifying Israel. How many pro-Israel NGOs do you have that are giving testimonies to the ICC? Zero. So it's very, very political. You have all these bodies who are basically getting funding mainly from European countries. They're saying Israel is a horrible entity. They give these testimonies to the ICC. And then the ICC is saying, okay, so if you're saying that Israel during Operation Protective Edge or Cast Lead or whatever did all these horrible things, let's investigate. Which is odd, because again, it's not something that it's supposed to do when two countries have a conflict. I don't see them, doing any investigation in the Western Sahara, in the Karabakh, in Northern Cyprus, and so on and so forth.
Fascinating. Okay. Thank you, Ran, so much. This was very interesting. The funniest thing was when the two lawyers started talking, you and Olga. This was, you guys started getting into the weeds. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I do want to end on time. We do have a few parents and we have a team that joined us. Gabby, who messaged me, she said, I really like learning. Can I join even though I'm not a parent? So Gabby, welcome. Anybody else has any last minute questions? Going once, going twice, going 3 times. All right. Thank you. Please stay tuned for our follow-up email. I did post in the chat an excellent resource and a source for you to watch a film that is narrated by Richard Camp, Colonel Camp. It's an absolutely wonderful documentary that we're going to make all of our teens watch, and we're going to test them on it. And stay tuned for more information.
All right.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ron. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye bye. Take care.